I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor, and I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. So this week, we're talking about proofreading symbols and whether we still need to learn them.
That's right. So we're going to run this episode as a sort of Q&A because as a stylistic line editor, I worked pretty much directly in raw text in Word documents now. So my days of using those symbols are over.
Yeah. Oh, do you feel sad about that? I bet you don't.
No.
No, not really. Doing better things now.
I found them really useful back in the day when I did use them. If I was still working on PDF, I love digital markup, and I found those symbols at times. There's nothing beats them, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So whereas you're basically not using them anymore, I still do a lot of work that involves marking up or annotating formatted files like PDFs. Although you did do a lot of that work back in the day, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. In fact, it's all I did. For years, I was a pure proofreader. And at the start of my career, I was working only on paper.
Oh, me too. Remember that? Lugging parcels to the post office for delivery to publishers.
I know. In some ways, it seems almost unrecognisable. So, Denise, let me ask my first question. Can you explain what these symbols are for listeners who aren't familiar with them?
Okay, so they are a set of symbols that are used in the text and in the margins of the text to indicate various changes that the proofreaders identify that needs to be made. So they could be changes to the text itself. For example, you may need to insert, replace, or delete characters, words, sentences, or even whole paragraphs. They are also used to indicate changes to the appearance of the text. So that may be changing bold or italic or capitals or lowercase, making changes to that, how it's presented on the page, and then also marking up changes to the position of text and the layout of elements on a page. So that could be to do with margins, indentation, and line spacing, that sort of thing.
It's such a good reminder that proofreading like this, when you're dealing with all the elements of the text, is so much more than typo hunting, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a massive job, and that's sometimes something that new proofreaders coming into the business don't appreciate. And some clients, that's fine. Look, some clients will want you just to work on raw text, but some won't.
Absolutely. And I think it's to be fair, it's the way that a lot of us come into the profession. Is that entry point is knowing that you're good at identifying problems with text in terms of grammar and typos and punctuation and that sort of thing. And it's a case of you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
But that's why getting good training, I know we're diverging a little bit here, but that's why getting good training to understand the scope of these sorts of jobs is so important, because if you're only ever working on perhaps novels or monographs and things like that, there may not be many different elements to it. So it may well just be, mainly typos and spelling errors and stuff like that. But if your first job is to work on a textbook or something that's got lots of different elements on the page and got a complex layout, you need to know how to handle that, and you need to know what you're looking for, and how to mark it up. And using proofreading marks is a really good way of just focusing your mind on that. And I realise we got completely off topic already.
That's all right. We'll come back to that. But first, I wanted to have a quick chat with you about the fact that there isn't yet a universal standard, is there? Which is just yet another. This is something we hear all the time when we're talking about the editorial practice, about how there are standards, but they aren't the same standards everywhere.
But they're not. That's the thing. And it's an important reminder that when you're talking to clients and other editorial professionals, is to not make assumptions that they're working with the same marks as you are, because as you said, there are different marks used in different countries. And although there is some overlap, I can look at a set of North American proofreader marks and recognize a lot of them, but they're not all the same.
No.
In the UK, the British Standards Institution, BSI, has a set of marks that are recognised here, and that's what is taught on UK programmes, and they are used in some other countries, but as we said, the marks in the US are a bit different.
And also the British Standards Institution marks that are currently in operation weren't the same as the ones being used 20 years ago. I can't remember what the date is on the current marks.
I think it's 2006?
2005, yeah.
2005.
Yeah. So, if you're a proofreader or an editor who has used to do this work and then has been out of the business for some time and is re-entering it, you might find that the expectations of your clients now, certainly in the UK, who, if they want you to know that use these marks, they're different.
Yeah.
Some of them,
and
not all of them.
Not all of them, yeah. And also some clients, some publishing houses kind of have their own versions of them as well.
Yeah.
They'll use their own kind of they may they're a shorthand anyway, but they may use their own shorthand within that shorthand for how they prefer to use them, which is just a reminder that when you're asked to do a markup, getting it really clear what the brief is, how they want things, ask them for examples if you're not sure, before you start ploughing in and doing the wrong thing potentially.
And it's a good reminder that the other thing these days, perhaps more than in the past, I think, many of us are working globally in ways that we weren't pre the digital age.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I'm just trying to emphasize that point you made about checking with the client, thinking about where do they live, or even if they live in the same place as you, what do they want?
Yeah.
Because the market and the sort of perspective has broadened.
Yeah. And the other thing to point out is that although we're working more globally now, in a way, the proofreading marks, and we'll come to why, can work in your favor in that case if you're working across different countries and languages. But we'll come to that. And it's not difficult to learn the differences.
Yes. I was gonna ask you about that, because it sometimes people think, oh well, that means I can't work for a US publisher if if I've been trained by a British institution, but as you said, the marks aren't. Not all of them are different, and they're logically where they are different. You can see there's a logical difference often.
Yeah, and it's easy enough to get a crib sheet online or from your publisher and do a bit of learning. Yeah.
So some people, Denise, argue that there's no point in learning this markup language because hardly anyone uses the symbols anymore. What do you say to that?
Well, hardly anyone isn't no one. So that's the short answer. I absolutely agree that the number of publishers that use them now is far fewer than 10, 15 years ago. But some publishers still do. And it can vary within publishers as well. In the larger publishers, one of the larger ones. Between departments, one of the large ones that I work for, I know that it can vary between departments. Some of them still do ask for, and I think that comes down to perhaps the desk editor that you might be working with, if they've been there a long time and that's the way that they do it, and their workflow and the designers that they work with, it all still fits. So don't just make assumptions that nobody uses them anymore. And if that's what a job needs, why wouldn't you make sure that you have the skills available? Even if you don't use them very often, it's just a good thing to have under your belt.
It's a bit of a no-brainer when you put it like that, actually.
Yeah.
And they are, and we touched on this earlier, they are a really precise way of communicating your corrections to the typesetter, aren't they? Because you've so often got little space.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. If you're marking up PDF proofs and you've got tight margins, you don't have space to write in long explanations of what you want done. And when these symbols are used correctly to identify the changes that you want done, they're unambiguous.
Yeah.
So a typesetter may not understand the actual content that they are setting. If you think of maybe complex technical or medical or philosophy texts, and they may not even have English as their first language. So many typesetting jobs are outsourced overseas now. So we can't expect that the typesetter is going to be able to engage with the text in order to interpret what you've put in the margins for your corrections. So your proofreading marks, they are a universal language, which everybody should be able to understand and not have any difficulty implementing the change, even if they don't actually understand what the actual context of the change is.
And that's such an important point, because sometimes when you're dealing with content that, so yes, you're fluent in English, but I might come across a text where I simply don't. I would find it quite difficult to explain to a typesetter why I need this doing here without becoming really, really massively wordy. I'm even having trouble now just being concise about what the issue is here. It's that precision that they give you. You put that in that position, it means do this, and it doesn't matter whether I'm from this country or that country, and we all know what it means.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one way, I guess a way of thinking about these marks as a way of standardizing how we can communicate our changes, because how many different ways might 10 proofreaders mark up changing an italic lowercase word to a bold small caps? I mean, there are all sorts of ways you might explain that. And you might put the words in different, or the instructions in different places, and you would certainly use quite a few words. Whereas if you just use those recognized symbols, it vastly reduces the chance of your instructions being misinterpreted. And then actually, instead of improving a text, you've caused a situation where you've introduced errors. Someone else has introduced
absolutely errors. It's a really good point. There's a reason why those symbols were introduced in the first place. It was to stop these sort of errors happening. And yes, there may sometimes be more than one way of using the symbols to indicate a change, but it's still going to be unambiguous however you decide to do that. If you're making multiple changes to one word, for example, there could be a couple of different ways of doing things, but it's still going to be within the confines of using these proofreading marks to indicate the changes you want. And so it's efficient,
Yeah.
You can get a lot of information about how to change text into really small margins on pages.
And just to go back to that, I mean, I'm thinking about my days of proofreading on PDF and on paper. Sometimes I was dealing with a margin of less than an inch.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might have really dense text that needs a lot of correcting.
And you might want to, when you were dealing with paper especially, you might have had a situation that you couldn't even use a markup tool like you can with which we'll talk about in a bit, but which you can with, like, say, Adobe or PDF Exchange or any other PDF editor. You had to convey like maybe 4, 5, 6 changes within the space of an inch, and the symbols let you do that.
Which is very clever if you think about it.
It really is.
So
Denise, what would you say to someone who says they just know they'll never work for publishers? They'll say, I only work with indie authors, and they don't even know what those symbols are. Why should learning this be a part of an assessed training course?
I think that's a fair point, because I think there's no doubt that most organizations, if not all organizations that are not traditional publishers, and certainly indie authors, have probably never even heard of these marks. And if you're never going to work with a publishing house, you might think, what is the point? But I still teach them as part of my courses because of everything that we've just said, but for a few additional reasons as well. I think it makes you think really precisely about what change you want to communicate to the typesetter. So when you're just typing text in or whatever, it's easy just to put a line through something and type something in the box if you're doing it on screen. But when you're using symbols and you're thinking about where they're being placed and how those marks will be interpreted, it makes you think about, will those marks and how I place them achieve the result that I want if the typesetter implements them in this way? Does what I've done here reflect what's in my head, the correction that's in my head? And I think it makes you consider the knock-on effects of your corrections. So I think it just changes your
mindset.
Your mindset a little bit, actually.
So again, that thing we've talked about in another episode in a very different context, but about retraining your brain to mark up with clarity.
Yeah.
And God, I remember years ago now how, when you were talking about knock-on effects there, it reminded me about how years ago how careful I had to be to ensure that my markup didn't impact on something 10 chapters later, like a cross-reference or a page number. So like if you'd indicate for a line to be, some spacing to be changed so that it was consistent with the recto and the verso are consistent.
Yeah.
And then you ask for a line to be knocked over, and it happens to take over a cross-reference or a page number or something, or it changes, it takes a key thing that's going to be in the index onto a new page. That means the page number's changed.
Yeah.
And then that's mentioned like later, and by the time you get to it, you've forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in some circumstances, if something's only ever going to be online, maybe it doesn't matter with pages, but certain things like, I've said many times before that I work on educational textbooks and things. These units are to a fixed layout. They're to a fixed number of pages.
Yeah.
If a lesson's on one double page spread, you cannot go over that. There is no option to. So you've got to be very careful thinking about, are your changes going to push stuff into basically being over matter?
Yeah.
And I just think that when you're certainly when you're first working with pages like that, working with proofreading marks just makes you just engage with the text more and just think more about, if I move this here, where does this bit at the bottom of the page go? Is there enough room or not? And I'm sure some people might disagree with me, but I just think it helps you to just engage a little bit more closely with the text.
And also, that when you push things like over into overmatter, I mean, that's expensive damage.
Yeah, somebody's going to have to sort it out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And the other thing to mention is that we both said this before. When we say I'm never going to do this, like, I remember years ago saying I'm never going to work with indie authors and I'm never going to do fiction. I remember saying that.
Really?
That was, obviously that was back in 2006, 2007. I had a very clear idea about what I was doing and what I was enjoying doing at the time. And here we are in 2023, and that's all I do.
Yeah.
So you might think that you're never going to do this, that you're never going to do that, but I still think that foundational training that I gave myself means that I've still got options now. If I decided, you know what, I'm just getting a new excitement for, I think I want to move. This isn't something that's happening at the moment. I really love what I do, and I've got no desire to go back into working for publishers on social science texts. But I don't know. Who knows what might happen 5 years down the road?
Yeah,
you just don't know.
And we know that, you can use, even if people aren't doing hard copy markup, you can do digital markup with proofreading stamps, as we both know. And so there is still this ability to do it on screen, just because we're not working directly with hard copy. And at the end of the day, you never know. You may well pick up an indie client who's got a publishing background and would really love you to use.
Yeah.
Can you just proofread
my novel, please? But you know what? If you want this job, I really want to hire you. I'll pay your rate, but you've got to do it. I want you to use proofreading symbols.
Yeah, you just don't know.
All right, I can't use those. Well, actually, I can, so I'd be all right. But it's not like, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's not like necessarily these learning this stuff is taking up everything you do.
No, and you're not doing it at the expense of anything else.
No, it's and not or.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the color coding and why proofreaders are sometimes asked to use different colors to mark up text. So the main ones are red and blue. you start by telling us a little bit about what they're for, given that they're the ones they're most likely to come into contact with?
So this goes back to the days of hard copy when, proofreaders were expected to use pen to mark up and different colors to identify whose error it is you're correcting.
Who's paying?
Who's paying for it, exactly, because the typesetter would then allocate the costs of resetting the changes to either, was it a typesetting error in the first place, or was it an editorial error?
In which case the publisher pays.
In which case the publisher pays for it. So typesetting errors would be marked up in red, and editorial errors would be marked up in blue.
Yeah. And then sometimes we'd even have green and black. I had a few, not very many jobs, but a couple of my clients in the old days used to ask me to use green to refer to errors that were not errors. It was markup as a result of collation if you were working, say, an edited volume, or once the design had been done. So it wasn't necessarily, or it could have been errors, things that were introduced at that stage, or because there'd been some later decisions made. And then black corrections might be ones that were made by an author.
The author, So sometimes when you're collating, you might have an author copy as well to collate in, and that would be black.
So do you think that we're as likely to be using this color markup as much?
No, I don't think so. To be absolutely honest, not. I think I've been asked to do it a couple of times way back at the beginning. So I think it's much less likely than the past, but I do still think it's very useful when you're training in identifying where the source of the error is, or who's
thinking about that.
Query. Yeah,
thinking about what the impact is and at what stage in the publishing workflow it happens.
Yeah, because it can help. It can actually help the publisher identify potential weaknesses in the publishing workflow.
Yeah,
if it's coming back and it's covered in blue, then your editor has missed a lot of stuff, or introduced errors. If it's a lot of red, then is your typesetter up to scratch? So I'm not saying that that's how it would be used now, but that is definitely one way of looking at it. And it would have been very obvious in the past when it literally came down to pounds and pence, like who was paying for all this. If a publisher had a copy editor that was missing a lot of stuff or introducing errors, I would imagine that seeing that in blue on a page would make them think, is there a training need here, or is this somebody that isn't suited to this job?
Or is the proofreader overmarking?
That's the other thing. Yes. Absolutely.
But again, it comes back to that thing that you mentioned right at the top about that. And this has come, I think, it's must be the third time we sort of hinted at this issue around how these marks can really help you engage with not just spellings and whether a comma's in the right place. It's a deeper engagement with layout, formatting, and the publishing workflow in general. There's definitely a place that these symbols and the learning of them
I think nowadays it's more about the learning of them, and because I think we do hear this because we know that many courses do still include, mine included, do still include an element of BSI, and there is sometimes pushback from students saying, why am I wasting my time doing this? And it's getting across that it's not wasting your time. It's an aid to your learning. Even if you never use them again, it's worth doing, even if it's only on this course and you put them to one side and you go on your lovely way and you have a great career with indie authors and never need to engage them. They're still there in the back of your mind.
It's like maths. How much of maths did we learn when we were in primary school and high school? And we thought, this is such a waste of time, I'll never use this. And then, 30 years later, you're camping and suddenly, for some reason, you need to work out the volume of your tent to make sure it will fit your family in it. And you don't know which one to buy. And you find that yourself going, oh, hang on, I can use pi r squared or something, or 2 pi r squared. Actually, I can't remember it. But you just don't know when that's supposedly irrelevant information
is going to come in handy.
Applied to life.
Yeah. And some people just end up making up their own little short 10, 3 or 4 even marks that they use with their own clients. If they've got a regular client, they might agree, look, we're going to use these 4 or 5 symbols to mean these things, and it's just between you and this regular client, but it's there.
It's actually having the professional publishing knowledge to be able to even offer that as a solution to a client who perhaps has got issues dealing with space, or even when Markup's digital. So again, earlier we touched on this and said we come back to it. So Denise, tell us briefly about other ways of marking up digital text that proofreaders need to know.
Okay, so you're assuming that you're working in a PDF viewer on screen. The most common one that you're likely to be dealing with is Adobe Reader DC, and you've got inbuilt markup tools there. So on your top ribbon, you've got a ribbon of commenting and drawing tools. So you've got commenting tools that can be used to insert, substitute, and delete text in the same way that you can insert, substitute, and delete with the proofreading symbols. But you also have additional tools like highlighting and notes, and you also have some really useful drawing tools on there to mark up maybe layout changes. So you can draw squares and open-ended circles and all sorts of stuff like that. And
most good PDF editors should have some form of these.
They'll have some form of it. It will vary from one to another, but I would say the most common way that you'll get a PDF from a publisher is probably with an Adobe markup, because so many use InDesign, and that just plays nicely. But there are others, like you've mentioned. PDF Exchange is one. Is there Foxit? Is that another one? But
the other thing about Reader DC is that it's free.
It's free, totally free. For pure proofreading, you don't need the pro version. You don't need the paid version. So I think a lot of proofreaders worry that new proofreaders worry that's going to be an expense that they maybe worry about having to buy the pro. You don't need it, not for proofreading. And then the other way is that you may be asked to proofread raw text, so in a Word document before it's been typeset or designed in any way, and we'd be more likely to sort of say that might be more like proof editing, where you might engage more with the text to make more corrections than just what you would do at proofreading
like
stage.
A hybrid, isn't it, of proofreading and what industry professionals tend to refer to as copy editing, but actually sometimes those terms make no sense to anybody living in the real world.
Exactly.
Just make my text better.
And you're generally not dealing with any design things or anything like that at that stage, because it's just purely the text that you're dealing with, and you would mark that up in your Word document, usually with track changes, so that you're when you return them, your client can see the changes that you've made, and they can accept or delete them. Or you would send them a clean copy and they might go, yeah, that looks great, and they're not even look at the changes you've made, which some choose to do. They just trust you. So that's with Word, and having the track changes on allows your client to see the corrections that you've made. You've actually engaged directly with the text.
So just one thing to mention, that I've got some digital versions of these proofreading symbols if people want to download them. So we'll put a link to those in the show notes. But Denise, you've also got a course that beginners will find really useful. Tell us about that.
So I've got a course called How to Mark Up PDF Page Proofs, which goes through everything about how to mark up. It does what it says on the tin, Louise. And
it's one of those really, really well named courses.
Yes. And it does mention how to use imported digital stamps when you're marking up on screen. And I'm also just in the process of finishing a course on how to use BSI symbols. So that's a little shorty course that should be out quite soon as well.
Gorgeous. I just definitely think this is a skill that is worth proofreaders learning, because that markup language, as we've said, is so deliciously efficient. And who wants to lose out on a job because they didn't learn a technical basic that's still required now and then?
Yeah, exactly. I still think it's a core component of any proofreading training. And while the emphasis may have shifted away from BSI symbols for obvious reasons, rather than ditching that learning, I do think we need to recognise that people need to be complementing that with additional knowledge, not replacing it entirely. And also, I don't know how you felt when you learned it. I felt like I was learning like a secret language. I felt like I had been entered. I had joined a club that knew how to use this language, and it actually made me feel a bit more like, oh, professional, because I knew how to engage with text in this different language. And I think that
reminds me of when I was a small child, I used to sometimes see my mum. She used to do transcription of various, notes in offices and stuff as secretarial work, and she had Pitman shorthand skills.
Oh wow, yes.
Sometimes I used to see her notes, and think, what?
Yeah,
it does. This is like spy language.
It is like spy language, isn't it? I whenever I see somebody writing short, I'm so impressed with it. It's just amazing. And so I think proofreading symbols, not quite the same, but it's in the same vicinity. That it's a language. It's a language of love to your text. That's what I like to think of it as. Yes.
Well, that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening again. If you'd like to help support the Editing Podcast, you can join our Patreon community for only £3 a month.
Yes, we'd love to have you on board. So if you're interested, hop over to patreon.com/editing podcast. All our patrons get exclusive access to a huge batch of transcripts. We'll pop a link in the show notes for you. In the meantime, she's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. Join us again next time. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.